must have been approached since the war by other nations to indulge in military activities of the kind you indulged in during the war. Is this correct?
It has happened, yes, exactly. And there is a lot of countries which oppose.
Would you name some of the countries?
Oh, I can name, for instance, United States of America.
They
were nearly the first one.
Is that so?
Something, yes.
What did they want you to do?
Oh, some special work.
You won't say exactly.
I wouldn't say it. You don't talk about it.
No. Have you been approached by countries like Cuba, for instance?
I was not officially approached, but unofficially I was approached also.
Was this by Castro?
It was first by Castro and now by the enemies of Castro. Everybody wants me.
I welcome this kind of examination.
You are free to do as we tell you. You are free to do as we tell you.
His head could be seen to move violently forward.
Back and to the left. Back and to the left.
That's why I don't read the newspaper. I'm a man. I'm 40.
What did the president know, and when did he know it?
I began by telling the president that there was a cancer growing on the presidency.
As of now, I am in control here in the White House.
This is crack cocaine from the White House. It could easily have been heroin or PCP. It's as innocent looking as candy.
Good evening, this is Mae Bressel in Carmel, California.
Anybody who's not willing to change based on what they learned is ignorant.
Coffee's for closers only.
I think we've given you enough.
Go on to Chicago and let's win there.
Keep hope alive. Keep hope alive. Keep hope alive.
This is the Midnight Rider News Show with S.T Patrick.
Hi, this is Professor David Dent of the JFK Historical Group. You're listening to the Midnight Rider News Show with S.T Patrick.
Hello, America and the world. Welcome to the Midnight Rider News Show. I'm S.T Patrick, your friendly neighborhood host, traipsing and traversing through the trials and travails that have so tempestuously and untruthfully been blasted into your eyes, ears, and minds by the state-sponsored talking heads, the court historians, and the textbook conglomerates that control information today. Tonight, we have episode 118, Casey Quinlan on Frontier Justice and the Assassination of JFK. Our guest tonight is author, researcher, and former school teacher, Casey Quinlan, and he'll join us next in the midnight hour. First, however, let's tidy up our humble abode. Now, we still have the PDF e-version of Garrison available at MidnightRiderNews.com, so if you don't have Garrison yet, you're really missing some incredible work done by some of the best researchers in this field today. So you can go to MidnightRiderNews.com for that. I would also like to announce that we've just set up our GoFundMe page for Garrison as well. The link is gofundme.com/GarrisonTheJournal. One more time, that's gofundme.com/GarrisonTheJournal. Now we'll have links to that on the MidnightRiderNews.com website, but we also posted it on Facebook and Twitter as well, so you can find the link on our accounts there. Now, the costs for doing a magazine like this are very high, and I paid for issue 1 completely on my own, and that was fine, but as you know, I don't really make a lot. So I also wanted the community to have a chance to be a part of this too. And I think it's a greater thing when everyone sort of pitches in to make a project everything that it can be. So there are different tiers for donations. Now, you can reserve a PDF of issue 2 at one tier. You can reserve a print copy of issue 2. So yes, if you're one of those who missed out on issue 1, on the print version of issue 1, due to how fast they sold out, you can reserve a print copy of issue 2 with another tier. And you can reserve both the PDF and a print copy together with a third tier. So all donors will have their name in the magazine, as you can probably expect. But really, I think the best reason to do this is because you believe in this project, because as I say all the time, you want to vote for good, meaningful projects with the most important vote that you have, your dollars. Thank you very much. And we'll be right back with Casey Quinlan.
This is Douglas Horn, author of the 5-volume Inside the Assassination Records Review Board, the U.S. government's final attempt to reconcile the conflicting medical evidence in the assassination of JFK. For more on the evidence supporting Zapruder film alteration and how Tom Whitehead and Sidney Wilkinson's newest work supports that conclusion, listen to episode 107 of the Midnight Rider News Show.
Casey Quinlan is an accomplished researcher. He hails from the great American Midwest, the Kansas City area to be more specific, and he has over 40 years' experience in the social studies classroom. That is admirable. He's the director of Project JFK, a student-oriented educational experience designed for high school students, college students, and adult learners who are exploring the murder of President John F. Kennedy. He's lectured on multiple college campuses. He's been a guest historian for both A&E and the History Channel, and he's the co-author with Brian Edwards of Beyond the Fence Line, the eyewitness testimony of Ed Hoffman and the murder of President Kennedy. He studied this case for more than 50 years, which is surprising because he still looks so young. And he's read over 1,200 books and publications about the case. Wow. Now, I recently saw Casey present a talk called Frontier Justice, and that became the basis of our show tonight. So here he is, researcher par excellence, Casey Quinlan. How are you this evening?
Very good. Good talking with you.
Well, it's great to talk to you. It sure is. It was great meeting you in Olney. That was such a good conference.
I'll tell you, David Denton puts on really good conferences, and I thought this one, in fact, I told him, I said, this is kind of a mini national conference, and he has really outdone himself and brought in some very good speakers and had a good quality crowd there, and it was pretty diverse.
It was diverse, absolutely. But there's one thing that I think nearly every conference attendee agreed upon, at least from what I was able to hear. There was widespread agreement that you, Brian Edwards, and David Knight all hit home runs. And for everyone out there listening to us tonight, I should also say that you three, or the KC contingent as I call you three gentlemen led off the conference as well. You were the morning of day one, which is not always easy. But now your own talk was called Frontier Justice, and I enjoyed it so much, and actually I learned from it so much, that I wanted to base an episode of the show around it. But before we do, now I ask this of almost every JFK researcher that comes on the show, because I find everyone's individual story is so interesting and inspiring at the same time. But how did you first become interested in the Kennedy assassination?
Well, I was 13 years old at the time when President Kennedy was murdered. And as a 13-year-old 8th grade boy, I hadn't really been introduced to girls yet, but I was playing basketball in my backyard. And I think what happened was my mom came running out, and she said, the president has been shot. Well, I'm a 13-year-old boy. I'm playing basketball, so I run inside, and I knew who President Kennedy was. And so I went inside there, and I do remember the exact time. It was 12:34. It's kind of hard not to remember that, but Walter Cronkite came on and started to explain what was going on, and I listened very much. My mom was crying, and it was a Friday, and I often wondered why I was home on a Friday during school, but we had just got that day off primarily because we sold, I think we had to sell 48 bars of World's Finest Chocolate to help supplement our athletic as well as our band and instrument programs. But that's how I first was introduced to John F. Kennedy's assassination, and then all the way through 8th grade to high school, I had written several papers, and then at the end of my senior year, supplemented with the murders of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy. And so it was kind of a disaster from 8th grade to senior year, and then coupled off with me being drafted to fight in a war that I thought was totally, absurd. But I went anyway because both my parents were World War II United States Marine veterans. So I really had not too much of a choice, but at the same time I wanted to protect and defend my country, but I sure as heck did not want to fight in this war, which I thought was absolutely ridiculous. So from that point on, I kept researching as much as I possibly could and read everything that was available, and by the time I hit 1972 and 1973, I had put on several programs discussing the possibility of there may have been a conspiracy involved in the murder of John F. Kennedy. And then from there on, about 56 years later, I'm still doing the very same thing. And I had an opportunity to run into a gentleman that I had corresponded with for probably about 3 or 4 years while in the military and also while I was in college, Mr. Penn Jones Jr., and he invited me to Dallas, Texas in 1970, and I stayed at his house, and he said, if you really are going to get involved in this, it is a lifetime situation. You will lose a lot of friends, and he says you will talk nothing about this throughout, nothing about anything, but you'll be talking about the murder of President Kennedy for the rest of your life. And I said, well, you're probably correct, but as a history teacher, I took the Kennedy assassination and molded it into a program and seeded it with things coming out of World War II, Vietnam, and into the modern-day world that we now live in.
Casey, much of your talk in Olney was about a man named Otto Skorzeny. Now, our listeners may recognize that name right away, as I'm sure some of them have the Skorzeny Papers by Ralph Guinness. It's a very good book. But what was the origin of your interest in Otto Skorzeny?
Well, I had known who Scorsini was prior to several of the books that came out in 2018, and just prior to that. But Scorsini was, and part of it is my research into World War II and to the intelligence agencies that were around on every side of the war, not only of the United States, but the German, the French, the British, as well as the Japanese. And I tried to put those particular agencies together with what information that was out there and available for me to at least do research on, and then try to draw some conclusions behind what happened to these agencies after the war was over. And little by little, those agencies came to the United States. They were kind of piecemealed into the brand new National Security Act that came out in 1947 and brought into existence the National Security Agency and the Central Intelligence Agency. And from there, those particular agencies, put together by people such as Allen Dulles and General Lyman Lemnitzer, General Donovan, and also General Eisenhower. You can't leave out those particular people because those were the people that were basically in charge of the emergence of these agencies coming out of World War II and bringing them to America. But not only did they bring them to America, but they set them up under a program called NATO back in Europe, and that was the protection unit to keep the NATO countries safe from invasion of foreign countries, i.e. specifically the Russians, the Soviets. And so we had a tremendous amount of help developing NATO along the lines with the German Abwehr, German intelligence, that was given to us and presented to us at the end of World War II with people like Reinhard Gehlen, and also one of the top operatives in Hitler's commando units, a guy by the name of Otto Skorzeny. So we knew who Skorzeny was based upon the idea that he was Hitler's #1 commando, and not only that, special forces all the way down the line. He was involved in all different types of things such as assassinations, overthrowing governments inside the Third Reich to build up the Third Reich. Very much like what our OSS and our Office of Naval Intelligence did during World War II over there. But we happened to capture this gentleman. In fact, he actually gave up in 1947, and he was sitting in the camps at Dachau waiting for trial. And we turned him for our side, and the people who turned him for our side were people like Allen Dulles and General Lyman Lemnitzer. And so when you see those two people getting a hold of this particular individual as a tremendous asset for our country and for the building up of NATO in these countries that were war-torn after Nazi Germany, and the possibility of the beginning of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, it was a perfect fit for Otto Skorzeny and a perfect fit for America. And so developed out of that is the Cold War attitude of taking individuals like Skorzeny, using his basic knowledge of covert operations and putting them to use in NATO and through NATO to protect those particular countries from invasion, assassinations, and anything else that would fall under that umbrella.
Casey, you used the word turn or turned to describe this transformation of Skorzeny into an American asset. And I should tell everyone here that the voice that you heard in tonight's opening montage was Skorzeny describing the work he had done for other nations, like he said, yes, like the United States. But I would ask you, was it a turn as much as it was expedient for maybe the remainder of his life? I mean, he'd seen what happened in Nuremberg. There was a real chance that if he doesn't turn, he doesn't live.
Well, I think most of our books will, if you will, propagandize that terminology with the idea that, these guys are turned for us. Well, I'm not sure if they actually really turned for us, other than the fact that they probably felt that they were aligned with the points of view of covert intelligence on the American side at the end of World War II, as well as the British side and the French side at the end of World War II. And so we brought these people in to actually become a major part of this covert apparatus that was going to be known to us as the CIA, and then bring these people over and train them in America, and then put them back into Europe, Germany, and then use these people to our benefit to protect our interests in the world at that particular time, which would be those, at least at the beginning, the 10 countries that were signed under the NATO pact, and then later on, I think it's probably 22 or 23.
Right, that valuable NATO pact. I mean, hey, who doesn't want to be in a mutual defense treaty with Estonia? But anyway, I know that Skorzeny was once called the most dangerous man in Europe, which I think is a bit exaggerated when compared to others who were still alive in Europe at that time. So do you think that title was at all apropos?
Well, I think part of it was, I think part of it's true. I think part of it's propaganda, but at the same time, he was Hitler's right-hand man. He was his number one commando. And at the same time, he did some things that were very much heroic on his part, especially going in and capturing Benito Mussolini and bringing him back to Germany in the Third Reich for Adolf Hitler. And also, he was, and this is kind of a stretch, but at the same time, I have read instances where Skorzeny was part of what was called the Malmedy massacre, where he and his troops dressed up like Americans and then actually shot and killed a lot of our own troops during the Battle of the Bulge, and that's what he was being tried for under what they were called as war crimes. But it was kind of interesting because when they were trying him for these particular crimes, some of the very people who wanted his head were some of the very same people that basically stood up in his behalf and said, if we had more soldiers like this, maybe we would have won the war, or so on and so forth. And the British, as well as the Americans, stood up and saluted him as an honorable soldier, and not necessarily a soldier of the Third Reich, but I think they were looking at him as a soldier that was following orders. And that's why I think a lot of these guys stood up and saluted him in honor of that. However, you can go off on that wherever you want to on this, and I think Skorzeny fell into, I would say, a bucket of gold, or maybe a tank of gold, and he came out, worth billions of dollars. He got to run all different types of agencies under the protection of NATO. He could go in any country that he wanted to, and then eventually, I believe, according to the papers that I've been reading, he had his own assassination squads, and he taught individuals through NATO in other countries how to commit political murder, how to get away with it, how to overthrow governments, how to set up governments after the takeover, and then wrote about those. And then he used a lot of different fronts that were provided to him through NATO, as well as a lot of the organizations that were backing him through a lot of the different banks in Europe, as well as Great Britain, France, and the United States. So he had a lot of front companies fronting him and using him to do some of these very things that our CIA could do and get away with on a legal basis in Europe. And we did have some written constitutional rules and regulations that said the CIA could not come over here and do things like this. But we could actually do that according to our constitutional laws. The CIA could perform those acts in Europe, and I think they did. And I think that is what has really ticked a lot of people off in Europe over the past 60 to 70 years, that the CIA was running these organizations to try to protect these countries from the invasion of the Russians, but at the same time, they were also protecting the interests of the United States investments, which I think that's what really ticked off a lot of these people and turned against us. And the United States has done that throughout the entire world. And that's the problem that we never teach in our American history, because we just don't know it unless you start digging into that particular material.
Well, correct. And as you said earlier, when we turn these Nazis or fascists or propagandists into American assets, they weren't assets embodying some sort of classical American ideal of some kind. You know, they didn't come over here with a love of baseball, apple pie, and Chevrolet. They were assets for the intelligence apparatus, which is very different than being assets for the American people.
Absolutely, and not only intelligence agencies, but the companies and the conglomerates that actually funnel tremendous amounts of money into these organizations for the purpose of establishing footholds in other countries with the banking systems and the systems that would build up legally on a basis, build a country up and make it look like it's a democratic republic. And I think on one end, you know, the United States wanted to rebuild Europe in a democratic process like the United States of America, but at the same time, we were definitely aware of the business interests that we could put over there. I'm talking about lending money to groups of people to build and develop land, and not only that, you had a lot of legitimate money going out, but at the same time, that money was legitimized by a lot of the false fronts that were used to actually almost like the mafia. And I hate to say that, but I think that's exactly what we were doing over there. In fact, a lot of the investigation by certain individuals in Italy as well as France believed that the United States was running a mafia, an organized crime over there. And I think even General Patton at one time, before he died, believed that's what the individuals who were at the Supreme Headquarters Allied Command personnel in Europe were doing. They were confiscating a lot of the Nazi gold, and obviously the Nazis confiscated the gold from all these countries that they went in and conquered. But then what happened to that gold? Okay, it's interesting to try to figure out where it went. An organization came in there, and sitting on the board of directors were four of the top intelligence officers, William Stevenson, Alan Dulles, individuals like that, William Donovan, a guy by the name of Hambro out of Great Britain. These were four of the top individuals, directors of an organization called the World Commerce Corporation, which came in and legitimately moved at least somewhere between $6 to $9 trillion worth of gold bullion out of Germany. Okay, now, the German intelligence was already doing that to begin with. And so what did we do? We hopped on board the same train that they were moving this stuff out, guys with like Reinhard Gehlen and guys like Otto Skorzeny. And we kept them legitimate according to us, but what they were actually doing was fronting for NATO, the United States of America, as well as organizations that were pumping money all over the place and using some of this Nazi gold to further their apparatus of possibly, I believe, taking over the entire world. And so now you get into, conspiracy of the world. Well, I'm not sure if I want to go there, but, little by little, I've had people tell me for the last 35 to 50 years that that's where you're going to end up. And ironic as it may seem, that's where we're heading.
Now, I know this is going to be just purely speculation, but if you had to guess where that gold is right now, or where that gold ended up, what would be your guess?
Well, I think at some particular point, some of it was moved into South America, but I also believe that a good portion of it ended up in Chase Manhattan Bank in New York City. And that's Rockefeller money. And I know a lot of people don't really want to get into the idea of Rockefeller running stuff, but at the same time, I've heard people tell me this, but little by little, this is what I'm finding out. There are some documents out there that Rockefeller money helped finance Germany from about 1933 on, and that the financing of Hitler's Germany, I don't think that they were doing that with the aspect of crucifying all the Jews because of their religious beliefs, but that became part of that under Hitler's reign. But when they lent $250 million to the Third Reich, it was for the purpose of building up the Third Reich, and hopefully, I think they felt to bring economic recovery to Germany as well as all of Europe. But Germany used it to fuel the fires of war, and they built a war machine that nobody else could build, especially after the Depression. And Germany built this thing up. And I think a lot of American investors saw the opportunity, especially bankers, saw the opportunity to invest in this for the future. And when you start to go over the War Crimes Act from probably about 1939 to right now, a lot of that material is just starting to be released. You'll find that the Bushes were involved in this, and that's no lie. They were involved in their banking system. The Rockefellers were involved in the banking system, and this is all Nazi Germany. And this is during the time of when Hitler was running the powers there. And at some particular time, maybe even the Kennedys were involved in this too. But you also have to understand these guys were major players that putting money into investments around the world and building up countries for the purpose of what? Americanizing them later on. So I don't think it's too far of a fetched thing to sit back and say, okay, people like Reinhard Gehlen and people like Otto Skorzeny would easily come over and become Americanized because they were already Americanized to begin with. The only difference is that their basic belief was Nazi Germany, and I think they kept that with them, but they got an apple attitude by the Americans who saw them and how they worked during World War II, brought them over here to help solidify the new world order, if you want to call it that. But and that new world order was, hopefully, I think the Americans basically felt, and the money powers felt that they were going to rebuild war-torn Germany in the wake of hopefully maybe what the United States was. But my gosh, there's a lot of things that people will sit back and say, well, we lied to the Soviet Union because at one time we were friends. We were allies against the Germans, and all of a sudden, boom. When the war with Germany is over, man, the new enemy becomes the Soviet Union. And part of that is that the Russians not only hated Germany, but the Germans hated the Russians. And so we got on board that because it was easy to do. And I think the internal groups of the United States military saw that this was the next war. And so I think who better to handle that than some of the people inside of Nazi Germany, and then turn over a lot of our affairs run through NATO over there by the Germans that we replaced and we trained and put them back into place at the end of World War II.
Yes, and I also feel like these post-war trials were a sort of weeding out process. I mean, we can continue to call them war crimes trials, but they were almost job interviews, or as I said, a weeding out process for U.S. and NATO intelligence. Now, the Skorzeny trial doesn't really commence until August of 1947, 2 years after the end of World War II, and almost 2 years after the Nuremberg trials have opened. They opened in November of 1945. We know that the party chairman, Martin Bormann, had been sentenced to die, the same for Hermann Goering. Rudolf Hess would get life. Albert Speer, who some may recognize, had 20 years. But you said earlier that Skorzeny was Hitler's right-hand man. Why was his trial any different?
Well, he sat at the docket there at Nuremberg, and for the most part, he was stationed at a place in Dachau, and he was there for, like you said, 2 years. But at the same time, the individuals who were running covert intelligence out of the Supreme Headquarters Allied Command personnel in Europe, which was called SHAPE at the time, and Eisenhower was in charge of that. Those particular people saw Skorzeny as a possible asset to run some of the programs that they wanted to run over in Europe, but he had better access because he knew what to do, and I think he spoke anywhere between 3 to 5 different languages. And so I think what happened with Skorzeny is that you had several individuals who got together and said, we need to vet him. We need to find out whether he would go along with the United States and go along with the new program that we wanted to invest in over here. And so, people like C.D. Jackson, Frank Lindsay, and later on, C.D. Jackson will become the editor of Time Life Incorporated, and Frank Lindsay will become the president of a corporation called ITEC. And these organizations will lead directly to Dallas, Texas. And these guys vetted Skorzeny, and when they vetted him and his wife, Elsie, and Elsie basically was the front man for Otto, and they were the husband and wife team to set up assassination schools. So if you have a husband and wife team that is being promoted by NATO and covered by NATO and already vetted by people like Jackson and Lindsay and also Dulles and William Donovan. In fact, I believe Donovan was the number one person who wanted Skorzeny on his team, and then handed it over to Allen Dulles and General Lyman Lemnitzer. And then, along with C.D. Jackson and Lindsay, they both of those people knew who Skorzeny was, and that he was part of this assassination culture brought into the CIA through the National Security Act. And this was just covert operations that was being run in Europe, and none of these guys said anything about it. So you talk about, and why would they? Because it's being run in Europe, okay? And for the most part, not too many people in America knew about this, but the military knew about it, the CIA knew about it, and now 56 years later, we're starting to find out more and more about our history. But part of that is because some of the archives are being opened up and looked at for the very first time. I know a lot of the military archives that can be opened up are opened up, and obviously I would love to be on the inner side of the military or even into the National Archives. I told my wife at one time, I said, if I got in the National Archives, you would never see me again. I'd probably just disappear in the walls there. But I'd have millions and millions of documents to go through, and I'd probably stay there forever. But at the same time, I believe Skorzeny and Reinhard Gehlen were instruments that were used by the Third Reich, but we saw we saw them as very possible assets for, and for want of a better name, I'm going to call it the New World Order, and the New World Order would be the United States sitting at the top. And they were going to do their dirty work for the Americans, and backed and fronted by NATO.
Well, before we get down to Dallas, I want to ask you about Operation Gladio and its importance to this pattern of covert operations throughout Europe and then in the U.S.
Well, there's very few books put out about Operation Gladio. In fact, I would say probably 99% of your history teachers at the high school level, let alone, I know that there are college professors that know about Operation Gladio, but Gladio was part of an operation at the end of World War II that was put into, let's put it this way, General Eisenhower and Prime Minister Churchill got together and said, we got to prevent Germany from ever rising again, and that's what's put in a lot of our history books at the high school level. But what you don't see is that operations like Operation Gladio was set up to prevent bombings and assassinations from taking place inside their countries and having their countries being infiltrated by communists. And we did not want that to take place. So what better way to do that than to put some of the Nazis who were tremendously in charge of Hitler's Third Reich, to put them in charge and backed by NATO. Operation Gladio set up shop in Italy, and it provoked domestic terrorism. It had terror campaigns on their own people, such in bombings, assassinations, false flag operations. And Gladio also organized schools for assassination. And they organized them in Belgium, Denmark, Germany, Greece, Luxembourg, and the headquarters for these schools were in Spain. And that's where Otto Skorzeny was set up. He was set up in Madrid. And it's interesting that the CIA's code name for Spain is the diagraph QJ. And so I looked at that, and a lot of that has been released within the last, I would say probably last 10 years. But trying to put these things together, it's like a giant mosaic puzzle that we get bits and pieces every year for the last 56 years. And all I wanted to do was find out about who killed JFK, and then it opens up all these different avenues through World War II, Vietnam, and so now I have to know what the heck World War II is about, Vietnam is about, and then get back to what I was going to find out to begin with, and who killed JFK. But it's a roundabout way. Bits and pieces are starting to fall into place.
I'm wondering at this point if Skorzeny ever traveled to the United States at all, if we have any record of that. Because I know that Dallas was only a little over 15 years after his trial.
Yeah, about 15, 16, 17 years later. Skorzeny, I'm still trying to figure out if he actually came to the United States. I'm not sure if he actually did. But he was set up. He was set up in Madrid, and a lot of people came to him. And I started laughing when about who I thought he was to begin with, and I said, God, he sounds like Don Corleone or the Godfather, and people would come to him and ask him for favors. But he was actually operating under and through NATO. And if NATO wanted something done, he and his wife got it done, and he had all these front organizations to use, and a lot of the front organizations were the United States military, the Pentagon, the Galen Organization, the British intelligence, as well as the United States intelligence, and even the chiefs of staff. One of the vehicles that he used to help transport assassins from place to place was through an organization. Well, obviously was through NATO, but the organization in NATO was the MAG program. And the MAG program, the military assistance program, that what we would do, we would come into a country and we'd In fact, I believe John F. Kennedy, when he was president, he had 1,600 people that were advisors. So the MAG program was military advisors, and assistants who were helping out that particular country. But, I think JFK had like 16,000 of them over in Vietnam at the time. But at the same time, this was started back in 1947, 1948, and then funneled through what we now know as NATO. But NATO, wouldn't it be nice to see exactly how NATO functioned and what the rules and regulations were at that particular time? I'm sure that a lot of those documents we'll never be able to get if they haven't been discarded or shredded already. But we do have remnants of some of those things, and Skorzeny kept pretty good notes, and that's where we see in his book. In fact, not his book, but it's Major Ralph P. Gaines's book, the Skorzeny Papers, and in those papers is where we find the history of Otto Skorzeny, at least after 1947, and some of his conduits and his contacts and the people that he was in contact with the rest of his life. And most of those people are the money people, are the oil people, and a lot of those oil people are in Dallas. So the contacts and the content and contacts that Skorzeny had are with some of the very same people that actually hated JFK and who have been earmarked throughout the last 56 years as people to look at that may have been involved in the murder of JFK, and that's where those contacts come in. So Skorzeny floats in and among and between all of those organizations and people.
So Skorzeny is sort of omnipresent throughout these organizations, and his fingerprints, or fingerprints of his previous operations, can be found all over these sort of Gladio-esque events. But as we start to really focus on Dallas on November 22nd, 1963, how will ZR Rifle and QJ Win become part of the Skorzeny operations and thus also part of Dallas?
All right, ST, you are asking probably the one of the toughest questions to answer, and I'll try to do my best on this. I've tried to describe this over the years to a lot of people by saying, if you take a golf ball and you slice a golf ball in half, and you've got 100,000 pieces of rubber bands that have been ripped apart, and then what you're going to have to try to do is put all those back together. And I think that's what we're seeing here. And that's how convoluted the CIA and the United States military, the covert intelligence apparatus that we had at the end of World War II began. And with the emergence of the, I'd say the technology age, or the technocracy that we have today, oh my God, it's gone on into infinity, and we're not really sure exactly who to believe or what to believe, and we don't know what is real news or fake news. And I don't particularly buy into Donald Trump's presidency, but some of the times when he starts talking about fake news, the fake news that I have seen is more with Fox than anything else. But at the same time, I think everybody employs different types of fake news so they can get ratings. And so it's rough for me to watch TV at night on the news, but I have to do it anyway. But as for Skorzeny, wow, I think he is the basic conduit for, basically for the United States. But he has filtered in to every facet and organization in Europe, into covert intelligence, covert operatives, and he was even, ironic as it may seem, he was even hired by the Mossad to go out and take care of a few problems that they had, and they were dealing with assassination. And so here you have an organization that he was going against tremendously at the end of during World War II. Now he becomes their, I guess for want of a better word, a hitman for them, or the person to contact to make sure that people are programmed to go over and do the job of assassinating somebody. And, nobody wants to use the word assassination, but I'm reading about 18 books right now, and one of the books that I'm reading is called I Hear You Paint Houses. And, oh, my God, this is a history of one of the best history books written on organized crime from about 1960 through about 1980. And, oh, my gosh, it goes into the basis of how that organized crime works. But at the same time, I'm not so sure if the mafia are the good guys or the bad guys anymore, and if the United States government with the United States military and the CIA are the good guys and the bad guys. I don't know which is which. And the problem with that is I would like to be able to stand and salute the American flag and say I'm with the CIA 100%. Well, to me, I think that's BS. I think what has happened throughout our society is not only in the United States but also throughout the entire globe, is that we have done things throughout the world to absolutely tick off people. We've committed assassinations in countries. We've overthrown leadership over there for whatever purpose it was, if we wanted to maintain control over that land. And I think what has happened is that we directly and indirectly funneled people into these particular avenues, which caused ISIS and other organizations to come up and start to terrorize all of Europe and now the United States. And I think these are direct results of what this entire NATO organization through the United States government, backed by and through organizations such as the MAG program and the CIA's Executive Action Program, which was handed down 100% to Skorzeny. And so what happens is that you have these major investigations over the last 50-some years in the United States of America, and we come across terminology like QJ Win. In fact, had the opportunity to talk to an individual who basically says, well, he says, I was working for the mafia as a conduit for the CIA, and he basically said, I'm the one that came up with that phrase, QJ Win. And I said, well, how the hell did you come up with something like that? And he says, I attend, racetracks. I like to watch the dogs and the horses run. And I started thinking, I go, win, place, and show. He goes, yeah. He says there would be QJ win, QJ place, QJ show. And he says those are some of the terminologies that found their way into the CIA as covert operatives, and names that would be funneled in and say, well, this is an operative, or it's an operation. And so, throughout those years, we're trying to figure out what is QJ, what is QJ win, and all these other terms that were being thrown at us through these major investigations, and little by little, we're starting to piecemeal this together. And I think that's exactly what happened when we started looking at things like QJ Win, with the idea that this guy was an asset, or it might have been not just one guy; it could have been any number of individuals. And I think one of the best explanations for these assets, these people who would become killers, was during the Iran-Contra hearings, when Oliver North was kind of backed into a question, and they asked him, they said, well, are you not shocked about what was going on? And he says, well, the director, and the director was William Casey, the CIA. He says the director wanted to go to an off-the-shelf, self-sustaining, standalone entity that could perform certain operations outside of the United States Constitution for the most part, and then cover up that whole thing under what was known as the national security, this blanket of national security. And my father, who was still alive in 1987, called me up and he says, do you want to explain this to me? I said, Dad, yeah, I'll explain it to you. But I said, you're an intelligent man. What do you think he's talking about? And he says, I think I know, but I don't want to say. Oh, tell me what you think it is. Is he talking about murder? 100%, Dad. That's what he's talking about. He is talking about an off-the-shelf. It's something that has already been made. It's an operational thing, but we won't use it. We'll put it up in the closet. And if we need it, we'll pull it down. And it's already operational. We just put it into use. And so I think people like Skorzeny ran those things. And he offered his assistance throughout the world using conduits like NATO, the MAG program, and then funneled those particular things through other programs such as the corporations that he was fronting to bring these things in. In fact, a lot of these corporations, if they wanted somebody taken care of, that's what he did. I mean, it sounds like we're talking about organized crime here. I'm not so sure if we're not really, I think maybe we are talking about that, but we're putting an American flag in front of it, and God forbid that we would say anything bad about America, but that's what I think we've done.
Exactly. I'm not even quite sure what patriotism is at this point. I'd have no idea how to define it if someone asked me to. But do you have a theory on the identity of QJ Win?
Well, I believe that in the book, the Skorzeny Papers, he doesn't come out directly and say that he is QJ Win, but everything leads up to the idea that Skorzeny is probably QJ Win. And QJ Win is an assassination program as well as an assassination asset. And it could be one, it could be both. And I think what was handed to Skorzeny was to develop this QJ Win program, and from that develop assets that could go out and kill people, okay, and do it under the guise or disguise of NATO and the MAG program, and if you could bring it over and hide it within the infrastructure of the United States military, as well as maybe the mafia, as well as maybe you could use anything at all over. You could use some of these major corporations over here, and the thing of it is that I think that's what happened. We have direct relationship with Skorzeny developing this QJ Win program, as well as QJ Win assets, which are assassination hitmen. And interesting enough, there was a gentleman by the name of Jean-René Suetra arrested that day and deported out of the United States by a military flight within 18 to 24 hours after the murder of John F. Kennedy. Well, where was Suetra at the time? Well, in the morning he was in Fort Worth. In the afternoon he was in Dallas. Okay, well, it's pretty, you're following JFK all the way, but at the same time, Suetra was the number one assassin, if you will, for the Skorzeny operation. And what was he doing there? Okay, well, we don't know if he actually killed anybody, but I believe that he operated teams that were governed by and run by Skorzeny, and then hidden within that infrastructure, and then was taken out of the United States, flown out by a military airlift. Now, what happens is that you might sit back and say, well, why would the military do that? Well, because they follow orders. If I'm a Spec 5 or a Spec 4, and I was ordered to make sure that this guy is brought up here and he's taken care of, he's gotten food. I don't know who he is, but my orders are to take care of him. I'm just going to follow orders, and I'll make sure that he's transported out of the United States. Okay, I'm following orders. Well, am I part of this entire what we in the conspiracy world would say? Is this part of a conspiracy? Well, it is, but it's easy if you're following orders. And you don't even know if those orders are conspiracy related. You don't even know who this guy is. So I think the easiest way for somebody to commit murder in the United States as well as outside the United States is, you could say the mafia did it, but in fact, I wouldn't be a bit surprised if the mafia was used as probably assets to kill some people inside the United States through the CIA and NATO and other organizations. And I think a lot of those particular things are going to open up later on. But I mean, you talk about a can of worms, trying to put these worms back in. Well, they're starting to get out. And the other bad part about it is that how do you go out and talk to the Americans now who want to believe in the United States of America, want to believe in the flag, want to believe in God bless America and all this stuff, and then you go out and cut down their last ditch belief in what the United States is. Well, I understand that. I don't like it, but at the same time, I'm looking for the truth. And I guess in some cases, if the truth hurts, well, by God, it's going to have to hurt, and you're going to have to know what the truth is. Now, what is the truth? Good God, help us all. I have no idea. I keep reading information and deciphering it and trying to decide for myself if this is the truth or not. Well, for the last 30, 35 years, I've been arguing with individuals that the Zapruder film has been altered. And some of the main people who I've been associated with say, no, the film is not altered. Well, I'm not an expert in this, but I can pick out 4 frames in the film that has been altered. And I'm sitting there going, guys, here are the splices. The film has been altered. And I use this at the college level. After I show the film to my students, they would look at this and say, oh, my God, there is a conspiracy here. This is what we see. And I said, okay, now, when you bring this out, and by the way, I'm teaching students at the university level who are going to become lawyers and judges, I tell them, I said, now, you can't use this film as documentary proof. And they go, why not? Because I said, it's been altered. And I said, you can't use something that has been altered. And I said, so you're up a creek without a paddle. Find a way to prove what you think you just saw. And so the major reason I brought that up is because I think every bit of film and photographic material that we have seen in the last 56 years has been altered. So if it's all been altered, then we're going to have to wipe the slate clean and start over. And I think that's where we're going. And in fact, for the last month and a half, that's exactly what I've been doing, is researching this and looking at the individuals that I thought were true blue. And they are. The only problem is they don't have all the information. And their interpretation of that information is what I have used to bring out to my students. Now, I believe there's a conspiracy here, 100%. But even then, you have to go through and try to figure out what is real, what is not real. And if every bit of film and photographs have been altered, where do you go?
Well, that is a difficult question, and yes, I would hate to have to wipe the slate clean and sort of start over at some point with the research. I do think that there are things we can use, and in John Judge's words, things we can know. But I think that the Skorzeny information is so vital and so important because, and I hope I explained this well, because I think that what it does is that it supports this idea of there being a structural conspiracy rather than a conspiracy of individuals. It wasn't a conspiracy that was sort of organized specifically for November 22nd, 1963, for one singular event. It was a conspiracy that existed in practice and an idea long before in terms of a model within a larger framework. So when I hear detractors say things like, well, you can never have a conspiracy that involved that many individuals, well, what the Skorzeny information tells us, and by proxy Gladio and Northwoods and Executive Action, ZR Rifle, etc., what that illustrates is that you already had that many assets involved for up to 20 years. They'd spent decades perfecting these sort of off-the-shelf kinds of programs and operations. So you therefore end up with such a large conspiracy with so many moving parts, all sort of micromanaging a small task, that one asset doesn't know what the other assets are doing at any one time. So they're all sort of kept in the dark while yet remaining vitally important to the operation. But yet they keep working, they keep moving, so they can constantly be moving towards the next operation. But then when I hear, well, you couldn't have organized a conspiracy that large, I respond by saying that you wouldn't have needed to organize for that day or for that crime. The specific crime was insignificant to the operators. The infrastructure already existed, so all that changed was the specific target and the specific location. So because the operation had been perfected over a 15 to 20 year time period and was part of this sort of extra constitutional framework that employed these seasoned veterans performing these micro skills, that makes the idea of a grand conspiracy very plausible.
You know, I think your explanation is right on. And I've had people, say things to me like, well, these guys were rogue elements in an organization, or they were rogue CIA people. Well, let me explain something to you right off. There is nothing rogue about that. When you're going to kill the President of the United States and you're going to cover the damn thing up and you're going to make sure you get away with the crime, then there's no rogue about it. And I think you're hitting it right on the head. This was an infrastructure that was already built into a structure that was brought into. And it was an off-the-shelf, self-sustaining, standalone entity. And it did perform something within the confines outside the United States, but they brought it into the United States, and then they used the same type of apparatus that I think what they were going to use, I think when several people wanted to overthrow Adolf Hitler, and they were going to use that infrastructure to control everything. But, a lot of people say, well, how could the Mafia get away with this? Well, I don't think the Mafia did it, okay? Now, I think that there may have been operational arms of the Mafia in and around Dealey Plaza, and maybe some of the people who were actually shooting were Mafia hitmen, trained by individuals to become the best assassins that there probably were. I don't think the Mafia did it. At one time I said, yeah, well, the Mafia is pretty powerful. Well, can the Mafia get the motorcade route changed? Can the Mafia then cover this whole thing up in Congress all these years? You need structure. You need orders. And the only thing I can think of that would do something like that would be the United States military. And little by little, we are starting to look at that and starting to realize that the infrastructure inside the national security state basically believed that JFK was a traitor. And so if they believe that, then they have to figure out a way of getting rid of him because he's going to be reelected in 1964. And the only way to do that is to kill him. And if you're going to kill him, you're going to make sure that they do it unbelievable, but they do it in broad daylight. And when they do it in broad daylight, well, how are you going to cover this thing up? Well, we got it all covered. And guess what? 56 years, part of the cover-up is the idea that we are continuing asking ourselves questions today. It isn't that I would like to drop this whole thing, but I would like to get some closure somewhere. And basically, a lot of people look at me and they go, well, they believe that more than one person did it. And I said, yeah, more than one person did it. In fact, what we're now looking at now, just to give you kind of an idea, we're looking at some of the audio tapes of the Dallas patrolmen who were surrounding JFK, and some of those audio tapes that were put together and piecemealed in 1971, those particular tapes, a guy by the name of Jackson, he's the outside rider on JFK's side. He drove up. He was chasing assassins on the grassy knoll. He believed that there was at least 5 or 6 people shooting from the North Grassy Knoll. And I'm sitting there going, good God, where was that information back then? Well, they kept him quiet. Now, who's they? God, everybody asked me who they were. If you're in a system where you have to follow orders, and everybody follows orders, it doesn't matter where you're at. But if you want to come out and tell people what you're doing, well, most people won't believe who you work for and why you're saying these things. You're the whistleblower. Nobody wants to believe that. You're the tattletale. But at the same time, I believe that type of infrastructure is what took place here. Skorzeny was that infrastructure that was built up at the end of World War II, and I believe that through that book that Gaines wrote, it tells a story and piecemeals that whole thing together and brings Skorzeny's organization right into Dallas and brings in his number one hitman, his number one assassin, by the name, and I think I gave you his name, Jean-René Suetre. Now, I've also read things where Suetre was really a guy by the name of Michael Mertz, and he was using Suetre's alias. Well, I don't care who it is. They're all part of that structure put together by Skorzeny, and Skorzeny was put that structure together through NATO and through the forces at the end of World War II, and that was the structure that was in Dallas that day.
So just to be clear for the listeners, we're saying that Skorzeny had the wherewithal and the experience, or the training, to organize this hit in Dallas. So what happens to Skorzeny after 1963?
He lives his life. I don't think anybody knows that he actually pulled this thing off. But the thing of it is that he was covered. Skorzeny had fronts all the way down the line. And the fronts were, like I said, were business organizations, was the United States military, and I think the United States military is going to protect their assets. And we have at least 12 to 14 individuals that knew who Skorzeny was, and I am sure that they basically felt that if anybody could do this, it would be the organization that Skorzeny put together and was let to run, not necessarily amok, but let to run according to how the United States government wanted him to run. Now, it's kind of hard for me to say United States government, but part of NATO is that military structure which has been left over in Europe, and part of that program was the assassination program used by Skorzeny, and I believe that Skorzeny put the program together, but he also had other people and other operatives. I don't think he was the only one that was doing this. I've talked to people who says, well, I was sent there that day to fly in an abort team, okay? And I've talked to these people, and I just sat back and I go, you want to explain what an abort team is? And so the person I was talking to would sit back and say, well, I may have flown in an assassination team. I said, to abort who? The assassination of President Kennedy or to abort Kennedy? Which one is it? Okay? So, you have all these different ideas that they're floating around, but anybody who could cover up the murder of a president of the United States for 56 years, destroy all the evidence, it's not the mafia. It's covered up by the United States government, and it's probably put together by the United States military through the CIA, which is a conduit of the United States military. And the people who did not like John F. Kennedy at the time were Lyman Lemnitzer. Lemnitzer hated him. Norstad hated him. The entire Joint Chiefs of Staff hated him. Dulles, they had no love for him. So you're talking the infrastructure, who's running the military at the time. Now, with their contacts all the way through the United States and the money that controls the military, they easily could pull this thing off, and only a handful of people could have known this. And the mafia has a great structure, but nothing like the United States military. You take orders or people die. And if they die, then you don't know why they die. You just follow orders.
Exactly. Well, Casey, I'd like to turn back to that grassy knoll for a few minutes, or actually Beyond the Fence Line, which happens to be the title of a book that you co-wrote with Brian Edwards, who'll be the guest on our next episode. Now, this important work is about witness Ed Hoffman. Many people out there have heard of Ed Hoffman. But for those who haven't, who is Ed Hoffman, and why is his story important to this case?
Ed is an eyewitness to the murder of John F. Kennedy, and a lot of people will dispute that, but if you had the opportunity to sit and talk with Ed, you would understand that this particular gentleman is not lying. He is a deaf mute, and we had to bring in special people to translate things, and as a teacher, I don't sign, but I did have access to sign language people, and I brought students that would sign. And Ed loved it, but every time Ed talked, or tried to talk and tried to describe something, my students listened. And when we brought students down there, Brian and I brought these students down there for probably about 35 years. And when we did that, we gave them the opportunity to create an oral history on the murder of John F. Kennedy. We brought out several eyewitnesses, and Ed was our number one eyewitness. And Ed would walk behind the picket fence on the grassy knoll, and he'd say, "This is what I saw. This is where I was standing." He was standing somewhere between 200 yards to 180 yards away from the murder of the president. He didn't actually see the president shot, but he saw people standing behind the picket fence on the grassy knoll, on the north grassy knoll. He said that he saw at least one individual who he thought was smoking at the time, but when the guy turned around from the distance that he saw, he could see something was smoking, but he saw a rifle in the guy's hand. And on The Men Who Killed Kennedy, the film put out by Nigel Turnbull, basically they did the interpretation wrong on Ed. He said that the man walked briskly and tossed a rifle to somebody. Well, I said, "Ed, are you sure this guy walked briskly?" He says, "No, he sprinted." He sprinted down the fence line and dumped the rifle off to somebody. Well, Brian and I got back there with Ed, and we sat there and we tried to interpret it. And every time Ed was trying to explain to our students, as well as us, he got very, very emotional. And not only that, he cried most of the time and showed this emotion, and our kids believed him 100%. We believe him 100%. There are detractors out there that says he was trying to gain money and stuff like that and fame. I don't think so. I think Ed was a true blue American, that he saw something that day and he wanted to report it. And as he told us in trying to report it, I asked him, I said, "Ed, did you run into a police officer and try to tell him what was going on?" And he said, "Yes." I said, "Would you relive that moment and show us exactly how you confronted the officer?" And when he did sign language. And I said, "No, Ed, I want you to tell me exactly what you tried to say." And so he kind of got the idea after the interpretation, and he tried talking. And as he tried talking, it sounded awful. And it sounded like somebody who at that particular period in time in 1963 would probably be looked at as an idiot. You know, get this guy out of my face. I don't know what he's talking about. Well, he's deaf and he's mute. He's not an idiot. He's one of the most intelligent eyewitnesses that I've ever come across. And Brian and I went through probably about 80 eyewitnesses down there that day. Well, not that day, but within the last 30, 40 years. And Ed was sincere. He went to his grave believing 100% that what he saw was at least a gunman who was firing at the president, and that he tried to get back in his car from where he was and drive around and try to find this guy. And I believe he was sincere all the time, that he was telling us these stories. And in fact, Ed, we thought several times that Ed had accidents, that those accidents may have been death threats on his life, but Ed probably wouldn't know that because he can't hear. So, but you know what a very famous person he was, and an intricate part about what was going on. And Ed was put down even by his mom. His mom and his dad, basically, and his grandmother didn't want to see him lose his life, so they lied about Ed telling the truth, that he stretched the truth out. And so that's where you get all these stories. And Ed was one of those individuals that needed to have his story told, so we decided to go ahead and tell it and put it out in book form.
Well, I think, okay, here's the deal. I think many people have doubts about some of these witnesses, sometimes because of their stories, but at other times I think it's because of their character, to be honest. And I'm not going to mention specific names here.
I understand.
Because, I mean, well, I'm just not willing to do that yet. But one of the things that I learned quickly when I finally dove into this community head first was that the witnesses are really treated like heroes in many instances. And it's a unique microculture, to be sure, this thing of researcher and witness. And I think you and Brian both have a healthy respect for people that are willing to tell their stories, but I don't think that either of you hoist them up on the proverbial shoulder, so to speak, either. And I've frankly always found Ed Hoffman both humble and believable. So in essence, I've never really thought that Ed Hoffman was one of those witnesses that are sort of seeking stardom, even within this very small community.
Never once did I ever think of that about Ed, but you're right that there are some people that have come out that have exploited some of this material and what they said they saw and what they believe. At the same time, there are people that haven't come out at all, that have deathbed confessions to say, this is who I was. In fact, we're starting to find out a couple of people who were actually standing on the grassy knoll that day, some women who have never come forward, and some of the daughters of these women say, well, that's my mom. Here's a picture of her. And so I'm sitting there going, you got to be kidding me. I can remember about 15 years ago, I brought a bunch of students down to Dallas, and they said, Mr. Quinlan, what are you doing? And I said, I'm looking for old people. And they go, why are you looking for old people? I want to see where they're standing. And sure enough, I found this woman. She was trying to position herself, so I walked up to her, and I said, I'll be right back. So I walked up to her, and I said, ma'am, were you here that day? And she looked at me, and she says, who are you? And I said, I'm a researcher, but I said, these are my students. We brought our students down. And she told me who she was, and she says, I was a 6, 7-year-old little girl holding onto my mom's hand, and she says, I think this is where I stood. And I said, did anybody ever ask you any questions? And she said, oh, yeah. But she says, I never went out in front and told people. She goes, my mother told me not to talk about it. And I said, well, can I ask you what you heard that day? She goes, I heard 2 booms. And I said, from where? And she said, the grassy knoll over there. So I'm sitting there going, good God. So, I mean, there are still people who are coming out. Now, how do you go about and prove that? Well, what we're doing now, some facial recognition and going back into some of these films and using blender programs that the new technology that's out there. And I'm telling you, it's bringing life back into an old problem. And maybe we might be able to solve this, but I don't know if we ever will. And not to the extent that, that at least I would like. I'd like the United States government to come out and say, yeah, we had him killed. Okay, well, fine.
Right. Yes. And then at least we could deal with that as a nation, right? I mean, all these anti-conspiracy people who always say that we can't handle what really happened. It's like we're Tom Cruise and they're Jack Nicholson, What we can't handle isn't the truth. It's 56 years of lies, missed educational opportunities, and frankly, to be honest, it's the bastardization of our own history. That's what we can't handle. And can you really blame us for getting a little cranky, a little emotional when this story is discussed? I mean, what Penn Jones told you was correct. This story never leaves you once it has you. And so I do want to take a moment here, sort of off the track, to really give you some credit. Now, I have a great respect for you and your work. I love that you come at it as a teacher, as I do, and I love what you're doing. I am so impressed with you. But okay, now you mentioned deathbed confessions earlier, so I must ask, what did you think of the E. Howard Hunt tape?
Well, I had already come across almost every person that he had talked about, but it was interesting to actually hear it from him. And I'm sitting there going, okay, I need to do more research here. I want to see some documentation on this. But, everybody's looking for documentation. And of course, I would always ask my students, I said, well, what is documentation? And they go, well, it's something that you can refer to that somebody else said. They wrote it down. I said, okay, so you're talking about 3 sources, which is the thing that really got me with when I was going to school, was the idea that you have to, if you're going to write a paper, you have to have 3 sources, and those 3 sources have to be viable sources. Well, what's a viable source? The New York Times, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Chicago Tribune. I mean, you're sitting there going, okay, those are acceptable. Or how about some of the ragtag newspaper articles that are out there? Oh, no, those aren't acceptable. I said, well, what makes the New York Times more acceptable? Because what I found out is that they lie too. In fact, they lie bigger than anybody else. But at the same time, yeah, from a history and teacher's point of view, I've been to almost every organization. I like those organizations, and I like they're all trying to find the truth. There are some, John Judge's organization, I think, was fantastic, COPA, and now it's Kappa. But at the same time, their organization, in fact, Brian Edwards and myself, we sat through a lot of these national conferences, and I said, Brian, we're both teachers. Would you like to get up and present? And he goes, yeah, why don't we? And I said, well, we should, because we can stand up in front of an audience, we can project, we can look at people in their eye, and I said we can put programs together that are better than these people are putting out now. And I said, it's boring for us to sit through this, but I said, I know I sat through a lot of boring classes in college to get where I wanted to be and then not act like those people and teach like I wanted to teach so people would be interested. One of my main goals, especially as a teacher, was to get people to read. And God, I tried to find some ways to get my kids to read. And so I said, okay, I'm going to present a problem to you. And so some of the problems I would present, I said, I want you to find the answer, so you're going to have to go to the library and open up a book. Well, good God, what's that? Okay, well, we had more books checked out on World War II, Vietnam, and anything about the Cold War and the Kennedy assassination, Martin Luther King, Robert F. Kennedy, that were available, especially in a public school library. Now, obviously, you couldn't check out the Bible because they don't allow it in there. But at the same time, I'm just sitting there going, you've got to get in and you've got to read. And you can hear me speak, but the very first thing that you need to do is question everything that I tell you. And that's exactly what a lot of my students learned. And they read. And one of the reasons that Brian and I put together Project JFK, CSI Dallas, was to take students down there and learn firsthand who these eyewitnesses are, get to meet them, and realize that they're ordinary, everyday people that were put in an extraordinary, everyday circumstance, and that was the murder of John F. Kennedy. And they found out that these people were real. And I said, you might ask them if you can get a picture with these people. And, a lot of that probably started with the idea of kind of a hero worship type thing. Well, I think what it was is the idea that these people are actually seeing people in reality who witnessed something that nobody wanted to believe. And I said, one of these days you're going to look back on this and you're going to say, I met that person, and it was the greatest experience that they've ever had. And almost every student that we took down there says that about our operation, that we actually succeeded in doing that.
So if anyone out there would like to know more about you or your work, or would like to follow you online, how can they do that?
Well, first of all, we have a website, and our website is projectjfk.com. You can go straight to that, and you'll see a lot of the material that we've talked about on air right now, and all of the other aspects that we're looking at, and as well as other organizations that we filter into and filter out. If you want more information, you can write me online there, and you can see Brian Edwards as well as David Knight. And David Knight, my gosh, David Knight was my student about 30 years ago, and it's amazing. Dave, we brought Dave into the fold here primarily because he has gone with us on every one of our programs down to Dallas. And Dave is, he is one of the smartest individuals got a hold of, and he's new, but he is so technologically advanced than Brian and I will ever be. And I have to sit down and I said, would you please explain this to me? And I said, you are now the teacher, so fill me in.
No, he's a great guy. He is. And this is probably a pretty good time to mention as well that because there's a logical order to what you and Brian and David do, I wanted to do 3 episodes with you all, and I felt like they needed to be back to back to back. And so they will be. We'll have Brian Edwards on our next episode, and then we'll have David Knight on the following episode after that. But this has been Casey Quinlan. He's just one of the best researchers on this case today, and he's a great guy as well. Thank you so much for being here, Casey.
Thank you, ST, and I'll tell you what, it was really a pleasure to meet you, and I'll tell you the organization that you guys are associated with, as well as the Garrison book, all that magazine is fantastic.
Hey, thank you so much for that. We definitely worked hard on it. This has been Casey Quinlan. I'm S.T. Patrick. This is the Midnight Rider News Show, and I'll be right back.
This is Ray Raphael, author of Founding Myths and A People's History of the American Revolution. For more on Washington, Hamilton, Jefferson, Revere, and the truth of America's founding fathers, listen to episode 76 of the Midnight Riders News Show. That's right, 76, as in 1776.
And thank you, Ray. That's really one of my favorite episodes. If you haven't heard it yet, please do. You will not be disappointed. But in thinking about that episode and in thinking about some of the themes that Casey Quinlan discussed tonight, I wanted to touch on the issue of patriotism. And I know, when you are having a problem of some kind, defining something, where do you go? You go to the dictionary. So, patriotism is devotion to and vigorous support for one's country. Wow. That didn't help. In fact, that makes it even more difficult to define. Because as Casey touched on tonight, and as Casey really asked also tonight, do I support the covert actions that took down Mossadegh in Iran, or Arbenz in Guatemala, or even Maduro today in Venezuela? No, I definitely don't. I don't support the forces that took down JFK or RFK or MLK or Malcolm X either. I don't support the forces that attempted to assassinate Reagan in 1981 or brought down Nixon from within in 1974 or paved the path to Pearl Harbor in 1941. I don't support this two-party monopoly that they call political parties, and I'll once again refuse to support either in 2020. But knowing that the Pentagon handsomely paid the NFL and other professional sports leagues for their paid acts of symbolic patriotism, the halftime heroes and such, things like that, the field-size flags, paid for by the Pentagon as a recruitment tool. I think it's bowing to propaganda to sort of watch those ceremonies at halftime, so I don't. And frankly, I don't clap or get teary-eyed when soldiers walk through the airport either. I don't support murder at home or abroad. Then, so you ask, what is a country and what is patriotic? Well, that's a good question. By and large, I still support the rights of people to be free. I'm amazed every day at things that I see Americans doing in the name of their families or their communities or their brothers and sisters, and for truth. I do believe that we grow up with hope, and quite often it's a hope that's lost as we sort of reach the realities of adulthood. But I still believe that everyone's American dream is chaseable, even if we're sort of locked in a perpetual death struggle with the survival of the richest. Now, I may or may not be doing the Midnight Rider News Show in many other countries. I may or may not be doing Garrison in many other countries. And I may not have had the life that I've had it not been exactly where it was. I have a hard time loving a symbol. I have a hard time loving what I'm supposed to love or what I'm shamed into loving if I have legitimate questions. But I do love the choices that I have, the skills and abilities that I've been taught, and the people I've met across this country. And if that's America, I'll say I'm patriotic. But if patriotism is genuflecting at the sound of Francis Scott Key or a flag, or hoping that our killers kill more than their killers, or standing during a Lee Greenwood song, then I, to be honest, think we have a lot of work to do. And defining a term is the least of our problems. From the other side of the mountain, on the best side of midnight, I do wish you peace.